Hello everybody and welcome to this lesson of the Ron Paul Curriculum Public Speaking thingy that I have to do every week. And as you can see from the title, this is a briefish history of Japan, and it's lesson 135, and I just spent like 30 minutes making this slideshow, so I read it over. I think it looks pretty good. You guys can tell me what you think when it's up and posted. Okay, so our first slide. These were the first people that came to Japan walked to the islands on a land bridge that existed a really long time ago, so about 40,000 years before Christ was born, and about 28,000 years later the land bridge was covered in water because a bunch of icebergs melted. And then for the longest time everybody there was just hunter-gatherers, and they lived around the volcanoes and in the forest, and they ate nuts and berries and killed things with rocks until eventually the Bronze Age happened, and a lot more influence came from places like Korea and China, who had sailed over to say hello. So all of the Bronze Age stuff, mainly the tools, made it a lot easier for farming to start, and a lot of rice kingdoms began to come up, and there were a lot. And people who owned these little areas were basically the kings. And think of it, if you want to, like early England, how it's just kind of like there's the town and that's technically the kingdom. So there were a lot of important little rice kingdoms, but probably the most important one at the time was Yamato, and that one was ruled by an emperor. And later on, they began to get some influence from Buddhism, from trading and whatever. And one of the emperors was like, hey, why don't we try this cool Buddhism thing? And everybody's like, but we like Shintoism. But he's like, don't you want to try a little bit of Buddhism? And they're like, okay, we'll try Buddhism. And that was put into effect about 604 years after Christ was born. So then there was something called the Taika Reform. The government was overthrown by Emperor Kotoku and a few other guys in 645. There was a lot of changes made, and Japan started to look a little bit more like China and began to sort of rule over their people a little bit stricter. And in fact, like, Japan started to take a lot of stuff from China. Like, they stole the alphabet. They made their own Buddhism later, their own version of Buddhism later on in 804. They wrote a couple history books about themselves and myths about themselves and the Chinese characters, and a lot of Chinese influenced art and poetry and stuff began to show up. So, for the longest time, ever since the empire actually became a thing, every time the emperor died and the new one was reelected, the capital was moved to where the current emperor lived, and eventually people were just starting to get tired of moving the government everywhere and just like, you know what, how about we all just settle in Kyoto, and that will be where we stay forever and ever. Granted, they didn't stay there forever and ever, but it seemed like that at the time. So one of the first things I did once I moved to Kyoto was I finally began to take over the northern part of the country, which up until that point they had only been ruling the southern half of it, which was closer to Korea. This part that they just conquered was the bit closer to Russia. And eventually, like, everything had, like, a really nice boom to it. There was more art, more poetry, more music, and all this stuff. And the emperor kind of became less and less concerned about the people that supplied his food. And the people were just kind of like, okay, so if the emperor's not going to protect us, who the heck is going to protect us then? Answer? Samurai. Now, these were kind of like hired mercenaries, sort of hired guns, sort of like security guards at the mall, except a lot more important. They were hired to protect the people, and they ended up doing a lot more governing than the emperor was, and eventually a military government called the shogunate began to take over, and they ruled from Edo. And they were like, yeah, sure, the emperor can still have his nice house and his nice things and whatever, and all your taxes will go to him, except we're going to run the place, and, you know, we're going to be the ones actually protecting you while he just sits there and looks fancy. After a little while, the emperor and the shogun began to have a little bit of a squabble with each other, and they began trying to overthrow each other. So the emperor first overthrew the shogun. The shogun got upset at this and smacked the emperor really hard in the face, and the shogunate became the official government system of Japan for the longest time. And more art happens. more like plays and stuff happens, and minimalist paintings begin to become a thing, which, if you don't know what minimalism is, it's basically just kind of like use as little colors as you can. And if you're still having a little bit of a hard time figuring this out, think of the opening crawl for the Disney movie Mulan. That's a pretty good example of minimalistic art. Everything is just a simple white scroll with black ink and a few cherry blossoms. So, more of a shogunate struggle, this time within themselves and not with the emperor. The current shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, I'm sorry if I'm butchering this, didn't have a son to take over the throne, so he turned to his brother, Yoshimi, who was a monk at the time, and told him, "Oh, can you please rule? I'm really tired and I want to retire, and you've basically been retired for who knows how long." And his brother was like, "Yeah, sure, okay, I'll stop being a monk and I'll rule for you." And surprise! The shogun had a kid named Yoshihisa, and this family has more Yoshis in Yoshi's Island at this point. So there's a lot of confusion. Who's gonna lead the people now? Who's gonna lead the people? The monk brother or the baby? And eventually there was a war that happened called the Onin War, and basically the empire kind of gave up on itself and broke into a bunch of little pieces, and this was called the Sengoku period, and all of these little pieces began infighting with each other. And eventually, about halfway through the Sengoku period, the English showed up and began to trade things, which the two most important things were they introduced guns and then they introduced Christianity. Then they were unified all over again. Imagawa region wanted to go through, wanted to capture Kyoto so they could rule, because Kyoto was still the capital at this point. But in order to get there, they had to go through this little colony called Oda. And surprise, surprise, Oda actually wins against the slightly bigger Imagawa clan. And Oda Nobunaga, I still suck at this pronunciation, began the unification. About halfway through, he was killed by a dude, and then the dude that killed him was killed by another dude named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who finished the conquering in 1590. And after Toyotomi, he was starting to die, and he turned to this council of 5 elders who were all like military leaders and told them, "Hey, can you guys raise my 5-year-old baby so he can rule after I'm dead?" And all of them were like, nope, we're going to do it. One of us is going to do it. And one of them, Tokugawa Ieyasu, actually became the shogun, and he began to rule in Edo again, and started something called Sakoku. Now, for those of you who don't know, I put it in parentheses here, Sakoku means closed country, and that means basically nobody is allowed in or out unless we say so, and they almost never said so. And the one exception to this was the Dutch traders. Even then, they technically were not allowed on Japanese soil. There was an artificial island put in one of the bays where they're like, okay, this is one place you can trade. You can come here once a year and no other time, or else we will shoot you dead. But anyway, despite Sakoku being a thing and everyone being closed off from each other, more prosperity happened. Yay! More art, more literature, more leisure things, like more plays and more concerts and stuff like that. And people began to learn a lot more about Europe and actually started to learn more because of the things that the Dutch people were bringing, like geography, medicine, art. They learned that skeletons were a lot more detailed than they originally thought. And not long afterwards, this little boom, prosperity died. And at this point, the United States kind of marched up to Japan and was like, hey, open up the country. We're tired of this being closed. We're tired of having to pay overpriced things to get your stuff from the Dutch people. And Japan was like, well, both of us are kind of in a stalemate. How about we have a compromise? You, England, and Russia are allowed in. And they're like, okay, yeah, sure, this makes sense. And 2 of the smaller little countries, Choshu and Satsuma, really did not like this idea and started something called the Boshin War, and with almost no help, overthrew the shogun and put Emperor Meiji into the capital, which was still called Edo, but was very quickly renamed to Eastern Capital, which is Tokyo. And the government was revamped yet again, a little bit more Western. And one of the things that comes with being Western is you get a little bit conquer happy, so they conquered Korea and a little smidge of China, and that little smidge of China kind of ticked off the Russians. They were like, hey, we're going to build a railroad there. And Japan's like, you can still build your railroad, dude. So Russia built the railroad. and guarded it with soldiers. And once it was done, they got a lot more soldiers. And Japan was like, hey, do you think maybe you could calm down a little bit? And Russia just kind of looked them in the face and slowly shook their head as they deployed more soldiers. Now, obviously Japan was kind of scared of Russia. I mean, and justifiably so. Like, Russia's a big place and all that stuff. So Japan actually turned to the UK and they made an alliance and eventually went to war together against Russia. And that just kind of stopped because Japan and Russia kind of got sick of it. Then World War I happened. Yay! Sarcasm. And Japan was kind of less concerned about all the fighting going on in Europe, and was like, hey, England, there's these German islands around us, and we know that you're fighting Germany. Is it okay if we take this? And the UK is like, yeah, sure, as long as you'll help us over here. So they did. And since they technically fought in the war, they were allowed into the League of Nations and were given a seat at the Paris Peace Conference, and they were allowed to keep the land that they took, which was kind of sweet for them, but kind of sucked for the Russians. The Great Depression happened. The economy just went straight down, and the military got grumpy and tried to take over Manchuria. League of Nations told them that that's not what they were supposed to do because they're part of the League of Nations, and Japan told them to just go away. And they got even more conquer happy and planned to take over the entire western part of the Pacific Ocean. And Hitler, eventually, later on, basically wrote a letter to Japan and was like, hey, I'm trying to conquer the world, you're trying to conquer the world, we have a friend in Italy trying to conquer the world, how about all three of us get together and have a conquer the world party? And they're like, yeah, sure. So they all fought and whatever, and the US kind of stood to the sidelines for most of the World War II, and eventually, when Japan blew up one of their ships, the USS Arizona in Hawaii, the US got upset about that and dropped 2 nuclear bombs in Japan, which at the time was not a joke, because those things are dangerous, and they were very experimental back then. Like, that land was devastated. But now Hiroshima is actually very pretty. I went there not too long ago, and it's actually really beautiful, and it's really peaceful, and it makes me very happy that it's been able to bounce back so well. So anyway, yeah, 2 bombs. Japan kind of goes downhill for a little while. But then modern times happened. Yay, for real! Because now they kind of had a little bit of an economic boom afterwards, and they started making everything that is awesome about the world, which is included, but not limited to, anime, video games, cameras, cars, all this cool tech. They've been making a bunch of cool things. Nintendo, Sony, Toyota, all those guys, they come from Japan, and they're all really awesome, and I love all their stuff because I just love my video games, obviously. So far, Japan's been holding up pretty great, even though it does have a couple of weird things going on for it, but I will not talk about that because that's not what this speech is for. And that's all I have to say, really, because that's the end of modern times. So, that's all I have to say. End of the speech. Japan is still pretty cool, makes all my favorite TV shows and stuff, and they have really nice music. So, that's it. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please let me know in the comment section, and feel free to subscribe, and I will see you all next week. Goodbye.